Sometimes manipulation doesn't look like shouting. It doesn't look like threats, and it rarely looks obvious. Sometimes it sounds calm, sometimes it sounds reasonable, sometimes it even sounds like concern. But the result is the same. You walk away from the conversation feeling confused, questioning your memory, and wondering if somehow this is your fault. That experience has a name. It's called gaslighting. Gaslighting is not just disagreement. It's not two people seeing things differently. Gaslighting is when someone systematically makes you question your own reality. And the danger of gaslighting is not just the manipulation. The danger is what it slowly does to your confidence. Over time, you stop trusting your instincts. You stop trusting your memory. Eventually, you stop trusting yourself. But the good news is this: gaslighting leaves patterns. And once you learn to recognize those patterns, the fog begins to clear. Let's talk about 3 signs you might be experiencing gaslighting and what you can do about it. Number 1, they constantly deny things that happened. One of the most common tactics in gaslighting is simple denial. You remember a conversation. You remember the words. You remember how it happened. But when you bring it up, they say something like, or, you're remembering it wrong, or even, you always twist things. At first, it feels like a misunderstanding, but when it keeps happening, again and again, you start to wonder if your memory is actually the problem. And that's the goal. Because once you doubt your own memory, you become easier to control. What should you do? Start documenting important conversations. Write things down. Save messages, not to win arguments, but to protect your clarity. When you have a record of reality, it becomes harder for someone else to rewrite it. Number 2, they turn your reactions into the problem. Another common sign of gaslighting is emotional reversal. Here's how it works. Someone says something hurtful. You respond. Maybe you raise your voice. Maybe you show frustration. Maybe you express that you're hurt. And suddenly, the conversation shifts. Now the focus is not what they said. The focus becomes how you reacted, they might say. You're overreacting. See, this is why talking to you is impossible. Notice what just happened. The original issue disappears. And now you're defending your emotions instead of addressing the problem. This tactic works because it forces you onto the defensive. Instead of clarity, the conversation becomes chaos. What should you do? Slow the conversation down. Instead of defending your emotions, calmly bring the focus back, you might say. We can talk about my reaction later. Right now, I want to address what was said. Clear communication pulls the conversation back to reality. Number 3, you leave conversations feeling constantly confused. This may be the most powerful signal of gaslighting. Not a single comment, not one argument, but a pattern. After certain conversations, you feel mentally exhausted. You replay the discussion in your head. You wonder how the conversation changed direction so quickly. And somehow, you always seem to walk away feeling responsible. That lingering confusion is not random. Confusion is often the tool, because when conversations feel complicated and tangled, you stop trusting your judgment. But here's an important truth. Healthy communication brings clarity. Manipulation creates fog. What should you do? Start paying attention to patterns. Ask yourself a simple question. Do I feel clearer after talking with this person or more confused? Your answer will tell you a lot. What to do moving forward? Recognizing gaslighting is powerful. But recognition is only the first step. The next step is protecting yourself. First, trust your instincts again. If something feels wrong consistently, that feeling deserves attention. Second, create boundaries around conversations. You are allowed to pause discussions that become manipulative. You are allowed to step away from arguments that twist reality. And third, seek outside perspective. Talk with trusted friends, mentors, people who communicate honestly. Gaslighting thrives in isolation. Clarity grows in community. Gaslighting rarely begins with something dramatic. It almost never starts with obvious manipulation or direct control. Instead, it begins quietly through small moments that seem insignificant at first. A comment here, a correction there, a subtle question about something you clearly remember. In the beginning, it feels harmless. It feels like a normal disagreement or a simple misunderstanding. But those small moments are often where the pattern begins. Someone might say, I don't remember it happening that way, even when you're certain of what you heard or saw. At first, you might pause and think about it. You might wonder if you misunderstood something or if your memory simply isn't perfect. After all, everyone forgets things sometimes. That natural self-reflection is what makes the tactic so effective. Gaslighting does not force doubt onto you all at once. It introduces doubt slowly, allowing it to grow over time. These small doubts start to chip away at your confidence in subtle ways. The first time it happens, you might brush it off. The second time, you might question yourself for a moment. By the third or fourth time, you might start replaying the conversation in your head, wondering if you missed something. The person creating the doubt often stays calm and confident while doing it, which makes the situation even more confusing. When someone speaks with certainty, it can make your own certainty feel weaker. Over time, these small moments accumulate. Each one alone might not seem like much, but together they begin to shape the way you see your own memory and perception. You start second-guessing yourself more often. You might hesitate before bringing up something you remember because you anticipate being told that you're wrong. Conversations that used to feel simple begin to feel complicated. Instead of trusting your memory, you start looking to the other person for confirmation of what actually happened. Gaslighting works so well because it targets something very human: our willingness to reflect and reconsider. Most people want to be fair. They want to acknowledge when they might be mistaken. They want to keep conversations peaceful rather than confrontational. A manipulative person can take advantage of that instinct. By repeatedly questioning your perception in subtle ways, they shift the balance of certainty in the conversation. Their version of events becomes the default, while yours begins to feel uncertain. Another reason the doubt grows so easily is because the questioning is often wrapped in calm language. It might sound like concern rather than contradiction. Someone might say, "Are you sure that's what happened?" Or, "I think you might be remembering it differently." These phrases seem polite on the surface. They don't sound aggressive. But when they appear repeatedly, they slowly train you to doubt your own recollection. As the pattern continues, the dynamic between two people begins to change. Instead of two individuals sharing perspectives, one person becomes the authority on what is real. Their memory is treated as reliable, while yours becomes something that must be verified. This shift often happens so gradually that you don't notice it right away. The change doesn't arrive all at once. It arrives through a series of small adjustments in how conversations unfold. You may begin to notice that you apologize more often, even when you're not entirely sure what you did wrong. You may start saying things like, "Maybe I'm remembering it wrong," or "I might be mistaken." Those phrases reflect the growing uncertainty that gaslighting creates. The person introducing the doubt doesn't need to argue loudly or aggressively. They only need to repeat the pattern enough times for you to start questioning yourself. What makes this particularly challenging is that the doubt can feel internal rather than imposed. Instead of recognizing the manipulation immediately, you may assume the confusion is coming from your own limitations. You might believe that you're simply forgetful, overly sensitive, or misinterpreting situations. The manipulator rarely announces what they're doing. The process remains subtle, hidden inside ordinary conversations. Eventually, the small doubts can influence not only how you remember past events, but also how you interpret present ones. You might hesitate before expressing your perspective. You might ask for reassurance about things you once felt certain about. The confidence you once had in your perception becomes weaker, replaced by the habit of checking with someone else before trusting your own understanding. All of this begins with moments that seem small and harmless: a simple denial, a quiet correction, a calm suggestion that you might be mistaken. Each moment alone may appear insignificant, but together they form a pattern that gradually reshapes your sense of certainty. What once felt clear becomes blurry, and what once felt obvious begins to feel questionable. The subtle questioning of your memory or perception is not accidental. It is the doorway through which deeper manipulation quietly enters everyday conversations. Confusion is often one of the earliest signals that something in a conversation is not healthy. Most people expect disagreements to happen in relationships, workplaces, and everyday interactions. Different opinions are normal, and conversations can sometimes be tense or emotional. But even when two people disagree strongly, healthy communication usually leads to some level of understanding or clarity. You may not agree with the other person, but you leave the discussion knowing what each side believes. When manipulation is involved, the experience feels very different. Instead of clarity, You walk away feeling mentally unsettled. You replay the conversation in your mind, trying to figure out how it unfolded the way it did. At first, you might think you simply misunderstood something. Maybe you spoke too quickly. Maybe you forgot a detail. These are reasonable assumptions because everyone occasionally makes mistakes in communication. But when this pattern happens repeatedly, the confusion begins to feel deeper than a simple misunderstanding. You might notice that certain conversations seem to twist and change direction in ways you did not expect. You start discussing one issue, but somehow the focus shifts to something else entirely. Before you realize it, the original topic disappears, and the conversation revolves around your tone, your reaction, or your memory. This shift can happen so smoothly that it's difficult to pinpoint the exact moment when things changed. By the end of the conversation, you feel uncertain about what was actually discussed. Another reason confusion becomes such a powerful warning sign is because it affects how you process your own thoughts. When a conversation is clear, you can easily explain what happened afterward. You can summarize the points that were made and describe how the discussion ended. But when manipulation enters the picture, explaining the conversation becomes difficult. The details feel tangled. The sequence of events feels blurry. You may find yourself struggling to describe what went wrong, even though you strongly feel that something did. Over time, this repeated confusion begins to influence your confidence in your own perspective. Instead of trusting your initial understanding of the situation, you start second, guessing yourself more frequently. You might pause before sharing your thoughts because you expect them to be questioned or dismissed. The more often you experience this pattern, the more likely you are to assume the confusion is your fault rather than a sign of manipulation. People who create this kind of confusion often rely on subtle techniques rather than direct confrontation. They may shift their statements slightly during the conversation, making it difficult to track exactly what was said earlier. They might reinterpret their own words in a different way, suggesting that you misunderstood them from the beginning. Because the changes are small and gradual, they are difficult to challenge directly. When you attempt to clarify the situation, you might be told that you are overthinking or misremembering the conversation. This dynamic creates a cycle where confusion feeds more confusion. The more uncertain you feel, the harder it becomes to respond with confidence. Instead of addressing the issue directly, you may spend more time explaining your perspective or defending your memory. Meanwhile, the conversation continues moving further away from the original topic. The person creating the confusion often remains calm and composed, which can make you feel even more uncertain about your own reactions. Confusion can also appear in the emotional aftermath of these conversations. After the discussion ends, you may continue thinking about it long after the moment has passed. You replay different parts of the dialogue in your mind, trying to understand how the situation became so complicated. You may question whether you said something wrong or reacted in the wrong way. This kind of mental replay becomes exhausting because it rarely leads to clear answers. One of the reasons confusion is such an important warning sign is that healthy communication usually reduces uncertainty rather than increasing it. Even when conversations involve disagreement or criticism, they still move toward resolution or understanding. Manipulative communication often moves in the opposite direction. The more the conversation continues, the less certain you feel about what actually happened. Instead of gaining clarity, you lose it. As this pattern continues, the confusion can begin to shape your expectations before conversations even start. You may approach discussions with hesitation, anticipating that things will become complicated again. Instead of feeling confident in expressing your thoughts, you might choose your words very carefully or avoid certain topics altogether. The conversation stops being a space for honest communication and becomes something you mentally prepare for, like navigating a maze where the path constantly changes. This is why confusion should never be ignored when it becomes a recurring pattern. A single confusing conversation can happen to anyone, but consistent confusion is different. When discussions regularly leave you doubting your memory, questioning your reactions, and struggling to understand what actually occurred, it may signal that something deeper is influencing the dynamic. The feeling of being mentally unsettled after repeated interactions is not random, and it often reflects a pattern where clarity is gradually replaced with uncertainty. Manipulators rarely take responsibility directly. Instead, they become very skilled at redirecting it. When a problem arises, the conversation does not stay focused on the behavior that caused the issue. Instead, it slowly moves toward you. The responsibility that should belong to them begins to shift step by step until you are the one explaining yourself. This shift often happens so smoothly that you don't immediately recognize what is taking place. In many situations, the conversation begins with a valid concern. You might bring up something that bothered you. Perhaps it was a comment that felt disrespectful, a promise that wasn't kept, or a pattern of behavior that continues to create tension. When you express that concern, you expect the discussion to focus on the issue itself. In healthy communication, people talk about what happened and work toward a solution. But when manipulation enters the conversation, the direction quickly changes. Instead of addressing the behavior you mentioned, the manipulator begins examining your reaction. They might say that your tone sounded aggressive or that the way you brought up the issue felt unfair. Suddenly, the focus is no longer on what happened, but on how you responded to it. The problem shifts from their actions to your delivery. This change may seem small at first, but it dramatically alters the entire conversation. Another common tactic is exaggerating your response so it appears unreasonable. If you calmly explain that something bothered you, the manipulator might describe your reaction as dramatic or emotional. By doing this, they reshape the narrative. What began as a simple concern becomes a story about your behavior instead. Now the conversation revolves around whether you were too sensitive or overreacting rather than examining the original issue. Manipulators also use selective memory to support this shift in blame. They may highlight small mistakes you made in the past while ignoring the context in which those mistakes happened. By bringing up unrelated moments, they create the impression that the current problem is just another example of your supposed pattern. This tactic makes it harder for you to stay focused on the present issue because the conversation becomes crowded with past accusations. Over time, this pattern can cause you to question your own role in situations more than necessary. You may start assuming that conflicts are automatically your responsibility. Even when you approach a discussion calmly and respectfully, you might still end up apologizing. The manipulator rarely needs to demand an apology directly. The conversation itself is structured in a way that leads you there. One reason this tactic works so effectively is that most people genuinely want to take responsibility when they are wrong. Accountability is a healthy and necessary part of relationships. Manipulators take advantage of that instinct by presenting blame in a way that feels reasonable at first. They might say things like, "I wouldn't have reacted this way if you hadn't said that," or "You made the situation worse by bringing it up like this." These statements subtly suggest that their behavior is a reaction to something you did. As these conversations repeat over time, you may begin approaching conflicts with hesitation. Instead of clearly expressing your concerns, you might soften them or avoid mentioning them altogether. You may worry that bringing up the issue will somehow turn against you again. The fear of being blamed becomes strong enough that silence feels easier than discussion. Another aspect of strategic blame shifting is the manipulator's ability to stay calm while you become increasingly frustrated. As the conversation moves away from the original problem, you might try to bring it back. But each attempt is redirected again. Eventually, the frustration builds and your emotional response becomes visible. The manipulator then uses that moment as evidence that you are the one creating conflict. The frustration they helped create becomes proof that you are the problem. This dynamic often leaves you feeling drained after conversations. You entered the discussion hoping to resolve something specific, but you leave feeling as though you have done something wrong. The original issue remains unaddressed, while your confidence in raising concerns becomes weaker. The more often this happens, the more natural it starts to feel, even though the pattern itself is deeply unhealthy. Strategic blame shifting does not rely on loud arguments or obvious hostility. It operates through subtle redirection and careful framing of the conversation. Each step moves the focus slightly further away from the manipulator's actions and closer to your reactions. By the end of the exchange, the responsibility that once belonged to them has quietly been placed on you. When this pattern becomes consistent, it reshapes how conflicts are handled altogether. Conversations stop being opportunities to understand problems and begin turning into situations where responsibility is constantly redirected. The person shifting the blame maintains control of the narrative, while the other person is left trying to defend themselves against accusations that slowly replace the original concern. Emotional reactions are a natural part of human communication. When someone says something hurtful, dismissive, or disrespectful, it is normal to feel something in response. Emotions signal that something matters to you. They show that a boundary may have been crossed or that a situation deserves attention. In healthy communication, emotional reactions are acknowledged as part of the conversation. People may not always agree, but they recognize that feelings are valid and worth understanding. In manipulative dynamics, however, emotions are often turned into a weapon against the person experiencing them. One of the most common tactics manipulators use is shifting attention away from what was said and toward how you reacted. The conversation might begin because of something specific that happened. Perhaps a comment was dismissive, a promise was broken, or a decision was made without considering you. When you respond to that moment, your reaction becomes the new focus. Instead of discussing the original issue, the manipulator begins examining your emotional response. They might say that you are being overly dramatic, or that you are taking things too personally. Words like sensitive, emotional, or overreacting are often used in these moments. These labels do more than criticize your reaction. They reshape the entire conversation. What started as a discussion about behavior becomes a conversation about your character. Your feelings are presented as evidence that the problem lies with you rather than with what originally happened. This tactic works because emotions are easy to highlight and easy to judge. If your voice becomes slightly louder or your tone shows frustration, those changes become the center of attention. The manipulator does not need to explain their actions anymore. Instead, they point to your reaction as proof that you are unreasonable. The discussion moves further away from the original issue with each passing moment. Another way this tactic appears is through subtle dismissal of your feelings. Instead of acknowledging what you expressed, the manipulator might minimize it. They might say that you are making a big deal out of nothing or that you are misunderstanding their intention. Even when you try to explain why something bothered you, your explanation is framed as unnecessary or exaggerated. Over time, this pattern can make you feel as though your emotions are a problem that needs to be controlled rather than a signal that something deserves attention. This dynamic becomes even more powerful when the manipulator stays calm while you grow frustrated. Because the conversation keeps shifting away from the original issue, you may try harder to explain yourself. You may repeat your point or attempt to clarify why the situation matters to you. As your frustration increases, the manipulator points to that frustration as further evidence that you are reacting emotionally. The calmness they display in that moment can make their perspective seem more reasonable, even though the conversation itself has been redirected. When this happens repeatedly, you may begin to question your own emotional responses. Instead of trusting what you feel, you start analyzing whether your reaction is acceptable or excessive. You may pause before expressing how something affects you because you anticipate being labeled as too sensitive. The natural instinct to communicate honestly becomes restrained by the fear of having your emotions dismissed. Another effect of this pattern is that it teaches you to suppress your reactions in order to avoid criticism. You may attempt to remain calm in situations that genuinely upset you, hoping that doing so will keep the conversation focused on the issue. However, manipulators often find other ways to redirect the discussion even when you stay composed. The goal is not truly about maintaining calm communication. The goal is to keep attention away from the original behavior. Over time, using emotional reactions against someone creates a deep sense of imbalance in communication. One person's feelings are constantly examined and criticized, while the other person's actions remain largely unaddressed. The conversation becomes less about solving problems and more about managing the manipulator's interpretation of your responses. This imbalance can slowly weaken your confidence in expressing yourself. The most challenging part of this dynamic is that emotional reactions are deeply human and difficult to separate from important conversations. When something matters to you, your emotions naturally become involved. Manipulators rely on this reality. They understand that reactions will occur and prepare to use those reactions as evidence against you. By focusing on your emotional response rather than the situation that created it, they gain control over the direction of the conversation. Eventually, this pattern can influence how you interpret your own feelings. You may start believing that being calm at all times is the only way to communicate effectively. You may begin filtering your responses carefully, avoiding any sign of frustration or hurt. Instead of discussing issues openly, you monitor your emotions constantly, trying to prevent them from becoming another reason for the conversation to turn against you. Clarity is one of the most powerful responses to manipulation because manipulation thrives in confusion. When conversations become tangled with shifting narratives, denial, and emotional redirection, it becomes difficult to see what is actually happening. The first real step toward protecting yourself is recognizing that the pattern exists. Once you begin to notice how certain conversations consistently leave you questioning your memory, your reactions, or your intentions, the situation starts to look different. What once felt like isolated misunderstandings begins to reveal itself as a repeated dynamic. Recognition changes the way you approach communication. Instead of assuming that every confusing interaction is your fault, you start observing the structure of the conversation itself. You notice when topics are redirected. You notice when responsibility is shifted. You notice when your emotions are used as the focus instead of the original issue. These observations restore something that manipulation often tries to take away: your sense of perspective. When you see the pattern clearly, it becomes harder for someone else to redefine reality around you. Clarity also involves slowing down the pace of conversations. Manipulative exchanges often move quickly, jumping from one point to another before you have time to fully respond. By intentionally slowing the discussion, you give yourself the space to stay grounded in what is actually being said. Instead of reacting immediately to every statement, you pause and bring the conversation back to the central issue. This calm focus prevents the discussion from drifting too far away from the original concern. Another important aspect of clarity is learning to state your perspective in simple, direct language. Manipulative conversations often become complicated because too many ideas are introduced at once. Keeping your message straightforward helps maintain focus. You might calmly repeat the point you originally made without adding unnecessary explanations. When you continue returning to the same clear statement, it becomes more difficult for the conversation to move into unrelated territory. Boundaries play an equally important role in protecting yourself. A boundary is not about controlling someone else's behavior. It is about defining what you are willing to engage with and what you are not. When you establish boundaries in conversations, you create limits around how discussions are allowed to unfold. For example, if someone repeatedly redirects a conversation away from the issue you raised, you can calmly state that you are willing to discuss the topic, but not the unrelated accusations being introduced. Setting boundaries often feels uncomfortable at first, especially if you are used to trying to resolve every misunderstanding immediately. Many people believe that staying in a conversation longer will eventually lead to clarity. In manipulative dynamics, however, extended discussions often create more confusion rather than less. Boundaries allow you to step away from conversations that are no longer productive. Choosing not to continue a circular discussion is sometimes the most effective way to protect your clarity. Another benefit of boundaries is that they reinforce your confidence in your own perspective. When you clearly state what you are willing to discuss and what you will not engage with, you shift the focus back toward your understanding of the situation. This does not mean refusing to listen to others. It simply means refusing to participate in conversations that distort or dismiss your experience repeatedly. Recognizing patterns also helps you prepare for future interactions. When you know that certain tactics may appear, you are less likely to be caught off guard. Instead of reacting with confusion, you can respond with calm awareness. The conversation may still be challenging, but your sense of direction remains stronger. You understand what you are trying to communicate, and you understand when the conversation is moving away from that purpose. Clarity and boundaries work together to rebuild the stability that manipulation tries to disrupt. Clarity helps you see what is happening, while boundaries help you decide how much of that behavior you will tolerate in conversation. Each time you apply these principles, the dynamic begins to change. Manipulation depends on uncertainty and unlimited access to your attention. When clarity replaces confusion and boundaries replace endless debate, the environment that allowed the manipulation to thrive becomes much weaker. Learning to maintain clarity in difficult conversations requires patience. It takes time to shift from constant self-doubt to a more confident understanding of your own perspective. Each moment of recognition strengthens that process. Each boundary reinforces the idea that your experience deserves to be respected in communication. As these responses become more natural, conversations that once felt overwhelming start to feel more manageable because you are no longer navigating them without direction.